So for the last 6 weeks, approximately, we've been looking at anti-Semitism. Here, listen to Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's speech in New York at the United Nations this past week. Raise your hand. Okay, so it's less than half. So I'm not going to play the whole thing, as it was over, I think it was at least 30 minutes. The reason I'm bringing this in, I want to play you like a 3-minute clip. Toward the end, he brought up the topic of anti-Semitism. And he brought it up in the context of the United Nations. He was pointing out how within the United Nations itself, anti-Semitism is rampant. And I'll allow him to make the point. But anyway, I thought we'd start off on this foot in light of what happened this past week in Israel or in Lebanon and in New York, and in light of the topic that we're studying. So hopefully we've got everything queued up here.
I first spoke from this podium as Israel's ambassador to the UN in 1984. That's exactly 40 years ago. And in my maiden speech here, I think it's the same podium, by the way. In my maiden speech here, I spoke against a proposal to expel Israel from this body. 4 decades later, I find myself defending Israel against that same preposterous proposal. And who's leading the charge this time? Not Hamas, but Abbas, Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas. This is the man who claims he wants peace with Israel. Yet he still refuses to condemn the horrific massacre of October 7th. He's still paying hundreds of millions to terrorists who murder Israelis and Americans. It's called pay for slay. The more you murder, the more you get paid. And he still wages unremitting diplomatic warfare against Israel's right to exist and against Israel's right to defend itself. And by the way, they amount to the same thing. Because if you can't defend yourself, you can't exist. Not in our neighborhood, certainly, and maybe not in yours. Standing in this podium 40 years ago, I told the sponsors of that outrageous resolution to expel Israel, gentlemen, check your fanaticism at the door. Today, I tell President Abbas and all of you who would shamefully support that resolution, check your fanaticism at the door. The singling out of the one and only Jewish state continues to be a moral stain on the United Nations. It has made this once respected institution contemptible in the eyes of decent people everywhere. But for the Palestinians, this UN House of Darkness is home court. They know that in this swamp of anti-Semitic bile, there's an automatic majority willing to demonize the Jewish state on anything. In this anti-Israel flat earth society, any false charge, any outlandish allegation can muster a majority. In the last decade, there have been more resolutions passed against Israel in this hall at the UN General Assembly than against the entire world combined. Actually, more than twice as many. Since 2014, this body condemned Israel 174 times. It condemned all the other countries in the world 73 times. That's more than 100 extra condemnations for the Jewish state. What hypocrisy, what a double standard, what a joke. So the UN's hostility. So all the speeches you heard today, all the hostility directed at Israel this year, it's not about Gaza. It's about Israel. It's always been about Israel's very existence. And I say to you, until the Jewish state is treated like other nations until this anti-Semitic swamp is drained, the UN will be viewed by fair-minded people everywhere as nothing more than a contemptuous farce. Now, given the anti-Semitism at the UN, it should surprise no one that the prosecutor at the ICC, one of the UN's affiliated organs, is considering issuing arrest warrants against me and Israel's defense minister, the democratically elected leaders of the democratic state of Israel. The ICC prosecutors rushed to judgment. His refusal to treat Israel with its independent courts the way other democracies are treated is hard to explain by anything other than pure anti-Semitism. Ladies and gentlemen, the real war criminals are not in Israel. They're in Iran. They're in Gaza, in Syria, in Lebanon.
It's green. It's green. All right, so this was the all right, take two.
Yeah.
Is there anything come from, I guess you're just running off the, okay, the lapel mic. Got it, got it. Okay, so I wanted to share that with you for this class. Where we left off last week. Anyone have any comments about this, since we have it up here? It's quite remarkable, and I didn't realize that Israel's been condemned over 100 times more since, I think he said 2014, than all the other countries combined. And that is the basis upon which he concludes there's anti-Semitism within the United Nations. It was also interesting how, I think there was one scene there where you pan to the audience and the Palestinian delegates or the representatives from Palestine were all missing. Actually, it was like every Arab nation was missing. They walked out in procession before Netanyahu started speaking. I didn't have a snap of that, but that's quite remarkable. Robert?
Yeah, that was going to be my observation, was half the hall was empty. They had all walked out.
Yeah.
So they didn't even want to hear what he had to say.
Yeah, it's sad. It's sad. Okay, so we left off last week looking at two women, and I introduced this with the subject of an allegory, and I'd asked, what is an allegory? Someone said a parable, and actually, when I went back and looked at this, a parable is a form of an allegory. Usually a parable is a very short allegory, or it's a single point allegory. Fables could be allegories, but fables, from what I could find, were always associated with animals, where animals are used to tell a story. So allegory comes from two Greek words, which would be to speak, and the other word would be another. So allegory is to speak in another way about something. So you're talking about something, but you're talking about it in another way. That would be an allegory. Allegories are more complex than a parable. Parable is a single point you're trying to make, and allegories can be much more complex. Paul had Let's see, I need to get back to my PowerPoint. I'll exit out of this. Paul had used two women in Galatians 4 come on. There we go. All right, so in Galatians 4, Paul used an allegory using Hagar and Sarah. And he was using them to get across 2 points about being under bondage and being free. His, I guess, point was that those who cling to the law are in bondage, like Hagar, the bondwoman, and those who have come to accept Jesus as Messiah, they're the ones who are the promised of the promised seed, of the free woman being Sarah. So I use that because I wanted to get back on our topic of anti-Semitism, some architecture, art that we see quite frequently in the Middle Ages in Europe. And I took you to Strasbourg, France, and took you to Strasbourg Cathedral. And this is a portal for this, I think it's a southern portal. You have to really zoom in. Now, we had a discussion with some brothers after class. I did confirm that the gentleman in the center holding a sword is not Jesus. It is, in fact, King Solomon, which is what I had said last week, but I kind of thought it would make more sense that it would have been Jesus in light of who the two characters are on the left and right. After doing a little bit more research, turns out Jesus is actually up here. I guess I missed that point. So Solomon is the man with the sword, and Jesus is up here holding, it looks like, the world in his hands. And then the point of this visit to Strasbourg was not to look at King Solomon or Jesus, but rather the two women on the left and right. Does anyone remember these two women? And they repeat in other locales and other cathedrals and other type of artwork. These two women, they have names. Anyone remember what their names are? Ecclesia is one. And the other was Synagoga. It's Greek. Both terms are Greek, or both are Greek words. Ecclesia, of course, means assembly or a group of called out ones. Synagoga is obviously a reference to synagogue, which happens to mean in Hebrew an assembly. So they're both assemblies, but they're assemblies of two different groups of people. And this is why I brought this up in light of our study on anti-Semitism. So the ones in the middle are from a different cathedral. I think it was Notre Dame Cathedral. Let's see if I can get my notes in sync. And they're supposed to represent the church or Christianity, and they're over here, these two, Ecclesia, and then Synagoga is represented over on the right-hand side. And there's things about these that are common that you will find. The symbols that accompany these characters or representative symbols, they often are carrying, at least Synagoga, the tablets that Moses brought down from Mount Sinai. They are always blindfolded. There's a staff that they usually carry, and the staff is broken. They're always looking away. If we go back here, Synagoga is over on the right, and she's looking away from Solomon and Jesus. And Ecclesia is always looking confident. She's gazing straight ahead. She's holding a goblet. Sometimes she's got a money purse. She's got an upright staff with the cross She's wearing a crown. So these are common traits or motifs that you will find. Here's another from a different cathedral. And what was interesting about this one was what was around the head or blinding the eyes of Synagoga on this particular representation. If we zoom in, come on. All right, so there's the money bag and the goblets. I know I've got a picture. There we go. So here we actually have a serpent wrapped around the head of Synagoga. And it actually gets worse and worse. If you examine these characters and where they show up, it can get really nasty as far as how Synagoga is represented.
Hey, Phil, I don't know if you brought it up last week, but...
Could you speak up?
Oh, I don't know if you brought it up last week, but it caught my attention right at the end of class. If you go back to see Solomon, there, he has a sword, and that's one of the most iconic stories of him deciding who the true mother was.
Right.
And he has that sword drawn, and I wonder if that is a suggestion towards that story, that he's dividing who the true mother is.
It could be. I think you maybe pointed out, unfortunately I got this covered up down here. There's also a little sculpture. That may be what's going on down there. Walter? Yeah, unfortunately I've got it covered up.
Yeah, one of your other slides showed it pretty good. Which one? Yeah, the very first one. Right there, you look at the bottom, you can see that's a two women, and the one on the right has a little baby in her hand.
Okay. So, let's get back. I kind of figure that it represents either wisdom or judgment as far as Solomon's presence there with the sword.
It goes very much along what that story was telling of his wisdom.
Yeah, it was a form of judgment. You know, he decided to rip the baby in two, which of course he didn't carry out with. But anyway, the focus is on how Christians depicted the church versus the synagogue. All right, I need to catch it.
So do you think their motives for including this synagoga were to create a contrast, or was it supposed to, was the original intent to be that, like, this is what Christianity encompasses, like the Jewish origins versus Christianity, or was the intent there to create the contrast all along?
Well, these characters actually show up separately before they come together. They often, you can see them on illuminated manuscripts. In fact, the first instance of synagoga is either a picture of a city representing Jerusalem or even an old man. And then eventually they become women, and then they get paired up in contrast. So there's a morphing over time. Jason?
So most art is supposed to elicit a feeling, right? It's supposed to bring in you, in your heart, something that you see that stirs up an emotion. And so what you have here is definitely the notion of pride and love towards the woman on the left-hand side, and scorn and ridicule for the woman on the right-hand side. So when you look at these reliefs, when you look at these statues, you're supposed to have the feeling like, oh, this one is bad. This one is not good.
Right, right. There's a superiority being projected when these two characters are contrasted side by side. All right, so let me see if I get caught up here. So this was where the blindfold comes in. Paul made reference to how the Jews to this day, when they read the Old Covenant, there's a veil that remains covering them. So that's where the veil or the blindfold or the serpent comes into the picture. So synagogue is always depicted triumphant. Ecclesia is always depicted triumphant. Synagogue is always depicted as defeated. The church is always royal. She's got her crown. The synagogue looks like she's lost her dominion, like a commoner. She is always blind. And if you're an illiterate person living in the 13th, 14th centuries, which is when Strasbourg Cathedral was constructed, and also when Notre Dame Cathedral was being built, if you looked at these art figures, they would definitely be telling you a story. If you're an illiterate person, someone would have to explain and spend time explaining the story, which unfortunately gives you a bad impression of the Jewish people. All right, so there's the staff, there's the blindfold. We'll get caught up here. So here's the crown. It may not have been obvious. So usually there's a crown related, or in these depictions of synagoga, there's a crown, and it's usually cast off. Here we have it at her feet. And if anyone wants to learn more about Ecclesia and Synagoga, you can go to Wikipedia, and there's plenty to read. All right, so I talked about the illuminated manuscripts. Here's an older example. If you look on the right-hand side, I've circled and then try to blow it up. It's not quite as clear in an illuminated format compared to a sculpted, but we have a figure with a blindfold over her eyes, and there's a staff here which is broken. There's something interesting that's been added to this particular illustration. Can anyone see what's different about this? Could speak up? There's a halo? Well, no, that's not Synagoga. Synagoga is over here. The one on the right is Synagoga.
Right. Oh, you were asking
so-
what synagogue, but anyway, that's what I
Right
saw.
here is Synagoga.
Yeah.
Keep hitting the.
But the
Okay,
Ecclesi-
do you see if
the
where I've
Ecclesia?
got the red circle? Can anyone see what that is?
Yeah. Looks like a horse.
It's a ram.
Ram.
It's a horned beast. It's
I
got
see.
two. Right there, there's a horn, and over here is a horn, and here's his nose, and she's got her hand around the ram's eyes. That's a new touch to the representation of synagogue. What does that represent? Any ideas? Jacob?
The dividing between the sheep and the goats, probably, in reference to further, you see the eyes being covered, so these goats did not even see or want to see what's going on.
Yeah, it's not bad, but this is a ram, and ram is a male sheep, so it doesn't quite work. But when I first looked at this, I thought it was a goat, but when I did the research, it's actually a ram, and a ram's a male sheep. So what would a male sheep represent here? Looks like Randy had his hand up.
My guess would be Abraham offering Isaac.
Yeah, I guess you could, except for, we would like to say that's part of the promise, or for the Abrahamic covenant, or it would be outside of the old covenant, which would be associated with the Jewish people. I'll give you the answer. It's a sacrificial system. sacrifices were part of the Mosaic institution given to the people of Israel. They were to offer sacrifices, and male sheep, rams were often part of that. So that's been added, and let's see what else. All right, so here's another place where you'll see Synagoga show up, and also Ecclesia, and this is part of the parable of the 10 virgins. And this is a 14th century manuscript. The wise virgins have been separated up here on the top half from the foolish virgins on the bottom. And I first thought these were bells, but they're upside down torches. If you look up here, the torch has fire coming out, so their lamps are trimmed and they have plenty of oil. Down here, they're upside down. But if you'll notice, each of these 5 groups has a leader. And over here, do they look familiar? She's holding a goblet. She's holding a staff. She's got a crown. Down here, we've got a blindfold, and we have a crown that's falling. And look, she's got something hiding. She's trying to hide behind her back. So we see it's just not in sculpture. Here it's even been transferred to a parable of the 10 virgins. And of course, now you're saying the Jewish people are foolish. Not only are they blind, children of the devil, deceived by the serpent wrapped around her head, ashamed of the commandments of God, and now you're saying that they're foolish. You can see us a little bit better here. All right, now all this depiction, negative depiction of synagoga, it's not something from the past. Even as late as the 19th century, you can find this depiction of the synagogue or the Jewish people in Christian art. So we're going to stay in France. This is the Basilica of Notre Dame in the city of Marienthal in France. And if you go to the west side of the cathedral and you look up above the doors, you'll see this. And if you look, Ecclesia is over here, and she's got her goblet, and something now has been added. The blood or water, the bodily fluids are coming out of Jesus, kind of like a spigot, and flowing into the goblet. And she's got her typical crown, she's got her upright staff, and over here on the right side, Jesus' left, we have Synagoga. She's blindfolded. Again, she's turning away. Here she's holding the tablets representing the covenant made with the Jewish people or the children of Israel. She's kind of like hiding them and not holding them up. She's ashamed of them. The staff here, this rod here is broken. This is from the 19th century. So this is not just a medieval phenomenon, this type of depiction, negative depiction of the Jewish people. And whenever you look at this type of artwork, it's more than just artwork. It comes with a story, and it is speaking theology. And when you look at this and you know what these characters represent, you come away thinking, well, the church must be better than Judaism. Christianity's got to be a better faith, and this is what the art is depicting. The church is triumphant, she's victorious, she's confident. The synagogue is miserable, she's downcast in every way. So art can communicate a story, and art can communicate theology. And the water flowing from Jesus' side, we find that from the book of John. And if you remember, those who were here a couple weeks ago, we spent some time looking at why half the time that John references the Jews, he does so in a negative light. So we're back to a link to John. Roger, did you have some?
Yeah, I didn't know if you were going to get to it. It sounded like you were getting ready to move on. The girl on the right, the far right, looks like she's asleep. Perhaps this sleep, again, the 10 virgin, they were asleep.
Yeah, I really don't know who the characters on the far ends are.
The one on the other side, it looks like Mary pregnant. But
Yeah,
that's
could be.
interesting since her son is already up on the cross.
Yeah, I mean, if this is the John's account of the crucifixion, then it could very well be when Jesus says to John, behold your mother, and John was given the responsibility of, taking care of Mary. So,
Okay.
and maybe the dozing is when they were asleep in the Garden of Gethsemane. I don't know. I didn't go into the whole scene there. All right, so if we leave, this is the reference here about the water and blood coming out from Jesus' side. If we leave France and we head out to northern Germany, there's a little town in Werben, W-E-R-B-E-N. There's a parish church, and you can see it over on the right-hand side. It's, again, in North Germany. There's a stained glass window I want to share with you here. It's the best image I could find of this. I'll try to zoom in. So we have here, again, the cross, and we have Synagoga and Ecclesia. What has been added, of course, Synagoga is over here, and we see common motifs, the crown being knocked off her head. We even see the ram, which honestly, this really looks like a goat, which is how, I think this is what I first found. But when I did the research, they say it's supposed to be a ram. What else do we see? She's looking downward. Yeah, okay, so she's got a blindfold. But there's two elements that we've never seen before. Can anyone depict, or can anyone pick them out? Roger?
Synagoga's riding on a donkey, and Ecclesia's riding on a lion.
Yeah.
And we can see the connection.
So it's an ass or a donkey. It's actually, I thought it was a lion, but if you look closely, there's an eagle's head, there's a man's head, and I think there's a ox head, which is supposed to represent the combination of the four gospel writers, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So the church is riding on top of the gospels. Yeah, I thought it would be a cherubim, but you normally don't see the church linked to the cherubim. You usually see, if you look at medieval art, you will often see the gospel writers depicted by various, each one has their own symbol, and that's what I believe is going on there. But there's one other thing that's been missed with Synagoga. I can't hear. A flag? Yeah, well, that's part of the staff, yeah. Actually, and even in the sculpture, if you look closely, there's cloth wrapped around the staff. But there's one more element that is new.
There's a sword coming down
Yeah.
on top of it.
A sword coming out of a cloud up here. So, I mean, the Christians really didn't hold back in depicting in a negative light the Jewish people. And I never found it, and it's a good thing I never did, but when I was researching the ram/goat, there are actually depictions of Synagoga and the animal in sexual poses with one another. And that is like getting a little bit too low, okay? But this was how the Christians were depicting the Jewish faith. Tim?
Yeah, well, in both of them, it's a hand holding the sword, and it's also a hand putting a crown on the Ecclesia side.
Right. Now, I want you to remember all this. It's kind of gone off on a little bit of an art tour here. What's important to remember is theology. Well, art can depict theology, And what's important to remember is theology has consequences. Your religious beliefs, how we depict other people, how we believe or think and treat other people, it has consequences. And here's a case in point. If we go back to Strasbourg Cathedral, and we go back to these statues, if anyone remembers, I said this cathedral was being constructed in the 14th century and then in the early part of the 13th and 14th centuries. Does anyone know what was happening during that time period? The middle of the 14th century into the early part of the, pretty much it would have been the middle of the 14th century. Does anyone know in Europe what would have been happening? A little bit louder. No. No. Very good. Very good. It also has another name. The Black Death. Very good. Yeah. So from 1346 to 1353, just as these cathedrals, both the Strasbourg Cathedral and even the Notre Dame Cathedral that we saw earlier, the statues, second group of statues, as these cathedrals were being completed, these statues that we had seen back here, they were just being installed right in the middle of the Black Plague, or the Black Death, the bubonic plague. And what I discovered when you look at the number of people that were affected, 50 million people, it is projected, perished in the Black Death. And that was about 50% of Europe's population. Okay? And what does this have to do with anti-Semitism? Well, actually, before we get there, give you a little bit of gruesome details about the Black Death. It was called the Black Death because it caused the skin and the flesh to die, and your skin would turn black. And left untreated, 80% of the victims would die within 8 days. And the plague was blamed eventually, well, on this little guy here. At least that's how it is today believed where the Black Death came from this little rat flea. But in the middle of the 14th century, in the middle of the Black Death, you want to guess who got the blame? It wasn't this little guy. It was the Jews. There's an article in Wikipedia, The Persecution of Jews During the Black Death, definitely worth checking out. And what you'll find if you read this, I've highlighted it here in the middle, you'll see the word Strasbourg. Because in Strasbourg, there was a massacre of several thousand Jews. And it was because they were blamed on the Black Death. What do you think the depiction of the Jewish people had as far as the response to the Black Death? You're depicting a people associated with the devil, with the serpent, with God's judgment. And back then, they had no idea what was at the cause or at the root of the Black Death. And you'll see over and over again over time, the Jewish people turn out to be the scapegoat if something goes wrong. If your wells run dry, it's because of the Jews. And if people are dropping over dead, it's because of the Jews. They actually, at the time, it was interesting, why did they blame the Jews? Well, there's a reason why the Jews were not dropping dead as fast as the rest of the Europeans. And there was a reason for that. Walter?
Yeah, I was going to tell you, it was strange that it was improportional. The Jews didn't seem to die from the plague as much as regular Europeans. And once again, they knew the law of God about health and cleanliness and all those things. So they just kept practicing their religion. And of course, God smiled upon them. Well, as you pointed out, the Christians said, oh, this is the devil's work, and that's why they're being spared, you know, because we're going through torment and all that.
Right. But back then, it was easier just to blame the Jews than to kind of recognize, hey, we've quarantined essentially these Jewish people in a ghetto, okay? And moreover, the Jewish people traditionally will bury their dead within 24 hours of death. Within 24 hours of death, practice is to bury your dead. Well, if you have bodies, dead bodies with fleas, the best thing is to bury that body as soon as possible. The longer the body remains around, the longer those fleas are going to remain around, which is going to only increase the spread of the plague. So, of course, they didn't know this, but it was so much easier to look and say, the Jews are not dying as quickly as non-Jews, and we know the Jews are of the devil. They must have made some type of bargain with the devil, and hence, you know, this is the result. Therefore, we need to blame Black Death on the Jewish people. And in Strasbourg, thousands were killed. They were actually burned alive. Here's a illuminated manuscript over here. This pile, this thing keeps doing that. This pile here is supposed to represent the Jews that are being burned alive, and all the population are helping conduct the execution of the Jewish people. So we'll leave it at that. Thank you for your attention.